The crack of the palm against skin echoed through the penthouse like a whip. Blaire Donovan, her dark braids trembling, stumbled back against the cold marble as a sharp sting radiated across her cheek. On the floor between them lay the evidence of the crime, a gold chain with a heavy green jade pendant shattered into pieces. Above her, Clara Sterling stood in a deep red luxury dress, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiled, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unrestrained aggression. "You're nothing but a tool," Clara hissed, her red-tipped finger pointing like a blade at Blaire's chest. "That necklace is worth more than your entire pathetic life. You exist to serve, not to destroy." She raised her hand again, fueled by a cocktail of elite entitlement and social rage, and ready to deliver a blow that would leave more than just a physical mark. Blaire braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut. She had spent months making herself invisible, enduring the cold voices and the demeaning chores just to fund her mother's medication and her final semester of nursing school. She was only 6 months away from trading this gray maid's uniform for scrubs, 6 months away from freedom. To survive, she had learned to swallow her pride, but the weight of the silence was becoming a scar on her soul. Just as Clara's hand began its descent, the air in the room turned to ice. A voice, quiet and lethal as a winter frost, cut through the screaming tension. Blaire looked up to see a man standing at the threshold, his silhouette absorbing the light like a shadow given form. It was Yoon Si-Kwon. Tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal-tailored suit, his face was a portrait of emotionless control. A dragon tattoo coiled up his neck, a dark reminder of the criminal underworld he commanded as the Ghost. He didn't need to shout to be feared. His gaze, heavy and calculating, swept from the blood on Blaire's lip to the imperial jade in his ex-wife's hand. The power in the room didn't just shift, it grounded itself in his presence. Si-Kwon stepped forward, his leather shoes silent on the marble, signaling that while Clara provided the chaos, he was the one who would provide the storm. Blaire moved through the cavernous Sterling penthouse with the practiced grace of someone who had learned that silence was her greatest asset. The morning sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating every speck of dust that dared to settle on the Italian marble. To the world, she was just a shadow in a gray uniform, a pair of hands that made coffee appear and laundry vanish. To Clara Sterling, she was less than that, an appliance that occasionally needed to be reminded of its place. She began her routine in the East Wing, her movements mechanical. Every surface had to be polished until it reflected her own tired eyes back at her. As she buffed the mahogany desk in the library, her hand lingered near the small vented locker in the staff hallway. Inside, tucked beneath her spare apron and a worn pair of sneakers, lay her true life. A heavy, dog-eared copy of Fundamentals of Nursing and a stack of color-coded anatomy flashcards. Those books were her sanctuary, though they felt like contraband in this house. Sometimes, during her 15-minute lunch break, she would hide in the laundry room, the scent of expensive detergent masking the smell of old paper as she memorized the chambers of the heart. She was only 6 months away. 180 days of biting her tongue and ignoring the sting of Clara's insults until she could trade this gray polyester for medical scrubs. The weight of her family's expectations was a constant, phantom pressure on her shoulders. Every night, when she returned to their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, her younger brother Marcus would be at the kitchen table, looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. He was brilliant, a kid who deserved a world that didn't require him to work 3 part-time jobs just to buy secondhand textbooks. Then there was her mother, whose breathing had become a shallow, whistling sound in the night, a reminder that the cost of her medication was equivalent to 2 weeks of Blaire's grueling labor. "Did you get the extra shifts, Blaire?" her mother would ask, her voice a fragile thread. "I've got it covered, Mama," Blaire always replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The lies were a mercy, but they were heavy. She couldn't tell them about the way Clara spoke to her or how her fingers ached from scrubbing grout with a toothbrush. She couldn't tell them that she felt her soul eroding a little more each day she spent in the Sterling penthouse. To them, she was the success story, the one who was going to pull them all out of the dark. As Blaire finished the library, she heard the sharp click of heels on the hardwood in the foyer. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted instantly, see the air growing thick with an approaching storm. Clara was home early, and the frantic, jagged energy she brought with her usually meant someone was going to pay for her bad mood. Blaire straightened her apron, took a steadying breath, and lowered her gaze. She needed this job. She needed the paycheck. She needed to remain invisible for just a little longer. She slipped out of the library and back into the hallway, a ghost moving through a museum of someone else's wealth, unaware that today, the silence she had worked so hard to maintain was about to be shattered forever. The heavy glass doors of the penthouse didn't just open, they were thrown back with a violence that rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Clara Sterling stormed into the room, a whirlwind of deep red silk and jagged fury. Her breathing was shallow and sharp, her eyes darting around the expansive living space like a predator looking for a place to sink its teeth. The charity luncheon had been a disaster. A subtle snub from the mayor's wife and a cold shoulder from the socialites she considered her peers had left her ego bruised and bleeding. She threw her designer clutch onto the marble island, the gold hardware clattering like a spent shell casing. To the world outside, Clara was a portrait of polished elegance, but within these walls, the mask slipped to reveal a hollow, poisonous core. She didn't see a home. She saw a kingdom where she was the only citizen who mattered, and currently, her throne felt threatened. "Blaire!" she shrieked, the name tearing through the silence of the apartment. Blaire appeared almost instantly from the hallway, her hands folded neatly over her gray apron, and her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. She could smell the expensive perfume and the underlying scent of a woman on the edge of a breakdown. The air in the room had curdled the moment Clara entered, turning thick with the metallic tang of impending conflict. "The display case!" Clara snapped, pacing the length of the room with a predatory restlessness. "It's dull. I can see a smudge from across the room. Do you think I pay you to stand around and look pathetic? Do you think your presence in this house is a charity project?" "I'll attend to it immediately, Mrs. Sterling," Blaire replied, her voice a low, steady anchor against the rising tide of Clara's rage. Clara stopped her pacing and turned, her eyes narrowing as she watched the younger woman move toward the custom-built glass cabinet. The cabinet housed Clara's most prized possessions, trophies of a life bought with alimony and social climbing. Every word Clara spoke was designed to draw blood, to transfer the humiliation she had felt at the luncheon onto someone who couldn't fight back. "You're just like the rest of them," Clara sneered, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as she followed Blaire. "Lazy, ungrateful. You think because you're hiding those little books in your locker that you're going somewhere? You're a maid, Blaire. You were born to clean up the messes of people who actually matter. Don't ever forget that." Blaire didn't flinch, though the words stung more than any physical blow. She reached for the soft microfiber cloth, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the heavy glass door of the display. She focused on the countdown in her head, 179 days, just a few more months of being a vessel for Clara's poison. But Clara wasn't finished. She needed more than just verbal submission. She needed a catalyst. She stepped closer, invading Blaire's personal space until she could see the reflection of her own twisted expression in the glass. The air was charged, a physical pressure building in the small space between the elite woman and the girl who was just trying to survive. One wrong move, one accidental breath, and the storm would break. The air in the library was thick with Clara's unspoken malice, a heavy, suffocating weight that made every breath Blaire took feel like a risk. Clara stood just inches away, her presence a jagged edge of expensive silk and unchecked ego. She wasn't just watching Blaire work. She was waiting for a fracture, a single moment of human weakness she could exploit to soothe her own bruised pride. Blaire reached into the display case, her movements fluid and cautious. She knew the value of the imperial jade necklace, or at least the value Clara had assigned to it. It was a heavy piece, the gold links thick and the emerald green stone polished to a mirror shine. As she lifted the cloth to buff the glass shelf, a sudden sharp movement from Clara made her flinch. It was subtle, just a step forward, an invasion of space, but in the high-tension vacuum of the room, it was enough. The microfiber cloth snagged on the temperamental latch of the display door. The glass swung wide with a sudden, heavy momentum, catching the edge of Blaire's hand. The necklace, balanced precariously on its velvet bust, tipped. Time seemed to decelerate. Blaire lunged, her fingers brushing against the cold gold, but the weight of the jade carried it down. It hit the marble floor with a sickening, metallic crunch. The gold links didn't just break, they scattered, and the jade pendant skidded across the white stone, a jagged crack appearing across its center. The silence that followed was more violent than the crash. "You clumsy, pathetic bitch," Clara whispered, the words dripping like acid. The mask of socialite elegance shattered, replaced by a raw, ugly animalism. Before Blaire could even form an apology, Clara moved. The first slap was a blur of red silk and platinum hair. It caught Blaire across the cheek with a force that sent her reeling, her knees hitting the hard marble. The sting was immediate, a white-hot burn that brought tears to her eyes. But Clara wasn't finished. She stepped into Blaire's space, her face contorted. "That is an imperial heirloom, $500,000, Clara shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that felt like it would shatter the windows. "Do you have any idea how many lifetimes you'd have to work to even touch a link of that chain? You're nothing. You're dirt." Clara's hand came down again, a closed fist this time that clipped Blaire's jaw. Blaire tasted copper, a warm trickle of blood blooming against her teeth. She didn't fight back. She couldn't. She stayed on the floor, her hands raised in a reflexive, defensive posture she had perfected over months of psychological warfare. She thought of her mother's medicine, of Marcus's tuition, of the nursing degree that felt like it was slipping away with every drop of blood that hit the floor. And she swallowed the scream, choosing survival over dignity, enduring the rain of insults and the physical weight of Clara's hatred. She curled into herself, a small gray figure on a vast sea of white marble, waiting for the storm to pass. She didn't hear the elevator chime. She didn't hear the heavy, measured footsteps approaching the library door. All she knew was the heat in her face and the terrifying reality that in this house she was less than the gold she had accidentally broken. The violent vibration of the room, the screaming, the sobbing, the sound of flesh hitting flesh, came to a sudden, absolute halt. It wasn't because Clara had run out of breath or because Blaire had stopped weeping. It was because the atmosphere itself seemed to solidify, turning brittle and cold. The chime of the private elevator was a soft, melodic note that felt like a death knell in the sudden vacuum of silence. Yoon Si-Kwon stepped out of the lift, his presence instantly claiming every inch of the penthouse. He stood nearly a head taller than anyone in the room, his broad shoulders filling the entryway. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame, a black shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a dragon tattoo coiling up his neck. He didn't move quickly. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, his hands resting naturally at his sides, his face a mask of terrifying, clinical calm. His eyes, dark and heavy with a preternatural weight, swept across the library. He saw the shattered display case. He saw the broken links of gold scattered like shrapnel. Finally, his gaze settled on Blaire, who was still curled on the marble floor, her hand pressed against her bleeding lip. The silence grew heavy, a physical pressure that made Clara's breath hitch in her throat. The aggression that had fueled her just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a frantic, jagged panic. She knew this silence. She knew that when Si-Kwon was at his quietest, he was at his most lethal. "Si-Kwon," Clara stammered, her voice high and unstable, a sharp contrast to the stillness he radiated. She tried to smooth her hair, her red-tipped fingers trembling. "You're early. This girl, she's a disaster. She broke the imperial jade. She's lucky I don't have her arrested right now." Si-Kwon didn't look at Clara. He didn't acknowledge her voice at all. Instead, he took a step forward, his leather shoes clicking with rhythmic, terrifying precision against the marble. With every step he took toward Blaire, the shadow he cast seemed to grow, swallowing the bright, artificial light of the penthouse. Blaire looked up, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She had heard the whispers about Clara's ex-husband, the man they called the Ghost, the man who ran the city's docks and its darkest corners with an iron, silent fist. She expected another blow, another person to tell her she was worth less than the dust she cleaned. Instead, Si-Kwon stopped just inches from her. He slowly reached down, his movements deliberate and devoid of any defensive posture. His hand, large and steady, moved toward the floor. Clara leaned forward, expecting him to snatch up the broken gold, but Si-Kwon's fingers didn't go for the necklace. His gaze remained locked on the bruise blooming across Blaire's jaw, a dark storm gathering behind his emotionless eyes. The power in the room had shifted entirely away from the woman in the red dress and the gold jewelry. It now belonged to the man who spoke without saying a word, a silent authority that signaled the time for Clara's unchecked cruelty had come to a definitive, violent end. Si-Kwon ignored Clara's frantic babbling, his focus entirely on the girl at his feet. He reached out not to strike, but to gently grip Blaire's chin, tilting her head toward the light. He studied the darkening bruise on her jaw with a clinical, terrifying intensity. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it might snap, a physical weight that pressed the air out of Clara's lungs. Slowly, Si-Kwon released Blaire and straightened his back, his gaze finally shifting to the imperial jade scattered across the floor. He leaned down and picked up the largest fragment, the heavy green pendant that Clara claimed was worth $500,000. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, rotating it slowly as the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows hit the surface. "500,000, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and resonant, carrying a vibration of lethal amusement. "Yes, it's an heirloom, Si-Kwon. You know how rare that jade is," Clara insisted, her voice trembling as she tried to reclaim her position of power. "She destroyed it. She should be in a cell." Si-Kwon didn't look at her. Instead, he applied a sudden, effortless pressure with his thumb. A sickening, dry crack filled the room. The unbreakable stone didn't shatter like ancient jade. It crumbled like cheap resin. He rubbed the fragments between his palms, and a fine, chalky dust drifted onto the marble floor. "High-quality jade doesn't powder under the thumb of a man, Clara," he said, his eyes finally locking onto hers. "Neither does 24-karat gold snap like dried twigs." He reached down and picked up one of the broken links of the chain. With a flick of his wrist, he bent the metal into a tight, jagged U-shape. It wasn't gold, it was plated brass, the cheap yellow film already flaking off to reveal the dull, industrial metal beneath. He tossed the ruined link onto the marble island, where it landed with a hollow, pathetic clink. "A market stall fraud," Si-Kwon stated, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "Worth maybe $200 on a good day. Yet you used it as an excuse to draw blood from someone who cannot fight you back." Clara's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. The foundation of her superiority, the wealth, the heirlooms, the status, was being dismantled by the only man who knew exactly how hollow her world truly was. She opened her mouth to argue, to weave a new lie, but the words died in her throat. Si-Kwon stepped over the remains of the fake necklace, closing the distance between him and his ex-wife until he was towering over her. He didn't raise his hand, but the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his controlled fury. "You always did have a taste for glass masquerading as diamonds," he whispered, his shadow completely enveloping her. "But today your theater ends. You've forgotten what it means to be human, and that is a debt I've come to collect." Blaire watched from the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had expected a witness to her humiliation, but instead, she was watching the systematic destruction of her oppressor. The ghost wasn't just a shadow, he was a mirror, reflecting the ugly truth of the woman in the red dress. Si-Kwon's gaze lingered on the raw purple bloom of the bruise on Blaire's jaw. In the sterile, high-altitude luxury of the penthouse, that mark of violence looked out of place, yet to him it was a hauntingly familiar map. For a fleeting second, The cold, calculating mask of the ghost flickered. He didn't see a maid in a gray uniform. He saw a mirror reflecting a ghost of his own. His mind drifted back, 30 years across the Pacific, to a cramped, windowless basement in Seoul that smelled of damp concrete and industrial lye. He remembered his mother, a woman who had once been as soft and resilient as the girl on the floor. She had spent her days scrubbing the porcelain thrones of the elite, her hands perpetually cracked and bleeding from the harsh chemicals. He remembered the night she had come home with a similar mark on her face, given to her by a man who thought his wealth bought him the right to her dignity. Si-Kwon had been 7 years old then, huddled in the corner, clutching a wooden spoon like a sword. He had watched her swallow her tears so she wouldn't frighten him, watching her transform her pain into a silent, desperate endurance just to put a bowl of rice in front of him. He had promised himself then that he would grow strong enough to shield her, but the world had been faster and crueler than a child's vow. By the time he had the power to move mountains, she was already gone, her heart given out from a lifetime of being invisible. "Get up," Si-Kwon said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a resonance that wasn't directed at Blaire, but at the injustice of the memory. Blaire hesitated, her fingers still hovering near her wounded lip. She looked up and, for the first time, saw something other than predatory frost in his eyes. There was a recognition there, a shared understanding of what it meant to be the dirt beneath a gold-plated heel. She reached out, her hand trembling, and Si-Kwon did something that caused Clara to let out a strangled gasp. He reached down and took Blaire's hand, his grip firm and steady, and pulled her to her feet. He didn't let go immediately. He looked at her calloused palms, recognizing the marks of labor, the same marks his mother had carried. He thought of the nursing books hidden in her locker. He knew the weight of those expectations, the crushing pressure of being the only hope for a family drowning in the shadows. "You are not the one who should be hiding your face today," he murmured, his voice a low thrum of controlled danger. He turned back to Clara, who was shrinking against the velvet sofa, her red dress now looking like a shroud. The shadow of the dragon on his neck seemed to darken, fueled by the embers of a 30-year-old rage. He wasn't just protecting a maid. He was finally answering the scream his mother had been forced to swallow. The penthouse, with all its marble and glass, felt suddenly fragile, as if the weight of Si-Kwon's history was enough to bring the entire tower crashing down. The debt of the past was finally being called to the surface, and Si-Kwon was ready to ensure that this time the invisible would be seen. Si-Kwon stood in the center of the library, a monolith of silent authority that seemed to drain the color from the room. He didn't look at Clara with anger. He looked at her with the clinical detachment of a man performing a necessary amputation. The power she had wielded like a jagged blade moments ago was gone, dissolved by the simple fact that the man who had provided it was now taking it back. "Si-Kwon, please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched the silk of her dress. "It was just a maid. You're overreacting because of a little misunderstanding." He didn't answer her. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew a sleek, black smartphone. He tapped the screen with a steady thumb, his face illuminated by the cold blue light. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of Clara's breathing. "This is Si-Kwon," he said into the phone, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Revoke the sterling accounts. All of them. The black card, the offshore trust in the Cayman branch, and the line of credit on the penthouse. Do it now." Clara let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "You can't do that. That's my life. I have a gala tonight. I have commitments." "You had commitments," Si-Kwon corrected, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now you have debts." He tapped the screen again. "Cancel the security detail at the gate. Tell the board at the Sterling Foundation that Clara is no longer a representative. She is to be blacklisted from all managed properties by sunset." With a few keystrokes, he had stripped her of the only armor she knew. To the city of Los Angeles, Clara Sterling had existed only because Yoon Si-Kwon allowed it. Without his name and his capital, she was a ghost in a red dress. The socialites who had snubbed her at lunch would now find her name erased from every guest list. The boutiques that bowed to her would lock their doors as she approached. "You're making me nothing," Clara wailed, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her phone onto the marble. "I am simply returning you to the state you truly occupy," Si-Kwon replied, his voice devoid of pity. "You called this girl nothing because she works with her hands. Now, we will see how you fare when you have nothing but your own." He turned away from her, effectively erasing her from the room. The transition was total. The woman who had been the master of the house was now a squatter in a museum of her own failed vanity. Si-Kwon looked at the security monitors in the hallway. The guards were already leaving their posts, their loyalty following the money that had just vanished. Blaire watched the exchange, her hand still hovering over her bruised jaw. She had witnessed the destruction of a life in less than 60 seconds. The contract that had kept Clara at the top of the social food chain hadn't just been broken, it had been incinerated. As the weight of her new reality sank in, Clara collapsed onto the velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands. She was finally invisible, just as she had forced others to be. Si-Kwon turned his back on the sobbing wreck that was his ex-wife, his movements shedding their lethal edge for something more grounded, more human. He walked toward Blaire, who had managed to pull herself into a chair, her hand still trembling as she wiped the drying blood from her lip. The air in the penthouse was still thin and cold, but around Si-Kwon, it felt strangely solid, like a shield against the chaos Clara had created. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, handing it to her in silence. When she took it, her eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't see a ghost. She saw a man who had looked into the same abyss of poverty and humiliation that she faced every morning. "The locker in the hallway," Si-Kwon said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The nursing books. How long have you been studying?" Blaire swallowed hard, the sting in her jaw a sharp reminder of the afternoon's cost. 6 months left, she whispered. I was almost there. Si-Kwon nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. He knew that for someone like Blaire, pity was just another form of being looked down upon. My mother never had the chance to finish anything. She died in a gray uniform just like yours, with the scent of bleach in her hair. The world doesn't make room for people like us unless we force it. He reached back into his jacket and produced a simple, heavy business card. It wasn't embossed with gold or flashy logos. It was matte black with a single embossed seal. I own a private medical facility in the city. It's for the people the big hospitals ignore. The ones who don't have insurance. The ones who are invisible. We need people who know what it's like to survive. Blaire looked at the card, then back at the man who had just dismantled a billionaire's life with a few phone calls. Go home, Blaire, he said, his gaze softening just a fraction. Tomorrow, a car will come for your mother. She'll be admitted to the clinic under my personal account. Her medication, her care, it's settled. And as for you, consider your tuition paid in full. There is a scholarship in my mother's name that has been waiting for someone with your spine. The breath Blaire had been holding for 3 months finally left her in a ragged, shaky exhale. The weight of Marcus's tuition, the fear of the next medical bill, the suffocating pressure of being Clara's punching bag, it all began to dissolve. Why? She asked, her voice finally finding its strength. Si-Kwon looked toward the shattered fake jade on the floor, then back at her. Because I've spent my life watching people break things because they think they can buy new ones. But you were trying to build something, and I've decided I'd rather see what you build than watch her break you. He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his silhouette once again blending into the shadows of the hallway. Blaire clutched the card to her chest, the weight of it feeling heavier and more valuable than all the fake gold in the room. She stood up, her legs finally steady, and walked toward the staff locker. She was done being a ghost. 1 year later, the sterile, our bright halls of the Hope Medical Center hummed with a different kind of energy, one of healing rather than hoarding. Blaire Donovan moved through the corridors with a stride that was no longer hesitant or invisible. She wore crisp, navy blue scrubs, a stethoscope draped around her neck like a medal of honor. The name tag pinned to her chest read Blaire Donovan, RN, a title that had cost her tears, blood, and 1,000 silent prayers. Her life had transformed in ways she once thought were reserved for fiction. Her mother's illness was in full remission, her brother Marcus was thriving in his first year of university, and for the first time in her life, Blaire could breathe without the crushing weight of desperation. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was a pillar of the community, on serving the very people the rest of the city preferred to forget. She stepped into the break room and glanced out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere in the distance, the penthouse she once scrubbed still stood, but its throne was vacant. The story of Clara Sterling's downfall had spread through the domestic worker networks like wildfire. A cautionary tale of a woman who lost a kingdom because she couldn't see the humanity in the person holding the cloth. In a small, cramped apartment on the edge of the city, the air was thick with the scent of cheap lemon bleach. Clara Sterling sat on the floor, her platinum hair dull and unstyled, her red nails long since broken and stained. There were no maids to summon, no credit lines to leverage, and no socialites to impress. She was surrounded by the very invisibility she had once weaponized against Blaire. As she scrubbed the grime from her own bathroom tiles, her back aching and her hands raw, she finally understood the cost of a life built on glass. No agency would hire her, and no friend would take her calls. She was living the life she had deemed pathetic, filing her own nails and counting pennies for the bus. Justice had arrived not with a gavel, but with a mirror. Blaire checked her watch and headed back to the ward. As she passed a small, private waiting area, she caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. Yoon Si-Kwon stood by the window, his charcoal suit as sharp as ever, the dragon tattoo on his neck a dark testament to a past he never forgot. He didn't approach her, and he didn't need to. He simply offered a single, an imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement from one survivor to another. On her dresser at home, Blaire kept the original jade pendant, still cracked but held together by a thin, delicate wire of real gold. She never sold it. It served as her daily reminder that dignity isn't something granted by wealth or stolen by a blow. It is an internal flame, unbreakable as stone. Blaire turned the corner to greet her next patient, her head held high, a woman who had finally traded the view from the bottom for a life at the top.